Neal Bascomb, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So we had you on about a year ago to talk about your book, The Perfect Mile, which was about Roger Bannister and John Lindy and Wes Santee racing to be the first man to run a sub 4-minute mile. Which we timed it just right. I mean, this is not, but like Roger Bannister died a few months after. I don't want to say like we timed, but like it was a great time. Like people got to learn about Bannister. It was kind of synced up, which was nice. People learned more about his legacy.
Exactly.
You got a new book out though, called The Escape Artist: A Band of Daredevil Pilots and the Greatest Prison Break of the Great War. And for those of you who don't know, the Great War is World War I. This book was a fun read. It was an action adventure story. There was comedy, suspense. It had it all. Before we get into the details of it, how did you find out about this ginormous prison break that happened from this POW camp in Germany that was pretty much impossible to escape from? Because I never heard of this story.
Well, I've always wanted to write an escape story. It's just the Escape from Alcatraz was one of my favorite movies growing up, and the sort of escapades that go into it, and the planning and the disguises and everything was just fascinating to me as a teenage boy. And so I always wanted to write one of these stories, but I was searching for the right one, and an editor of mine wanted me to write about the Stalag Luft escape, the Great Escape of World War II, but that ground had been fairly well tread. And so I was looking for something else, and I finally ended up reading this book about MI9, which was the World War II escape and invasion service of the British. And in that book, they note this escape that happened in the previous war, in World War I, at a place called Holzminden. And it turns out that those people who executed that escape became the teachers and the professors of MI9. And that was the sort of hook that grabbed me. I wanted to learn about this original escape. And the further I plumbed into it, it just turned out to be an amazing story.
Yeah, so you mentioned The Great Escape. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the movie with Steve McQueen jumping over the fence on the motorcycle, looking cool.
Very cool.
Right. And as I was reading this book, I mean, I was like, I'm reading the prequel of The Great Escape. Like it almost, the way they did it, and we'll talk about how they did it, like it basically set the standard of how these guys in World War II were planning prison escapes.
Yeah, I mean, the escape at Holzminden was really the roadmap for the Great Escape that we all know of.
All right. And so what's great about this story, too, is that not only is the escape itself just fun, and there's so many interesting things about it, but you use it as a backdrop to explore other facets of World War I that a lot of people aren't familiar with. For example, I mean, the subtitle, it's, the Daredevil Pilots and the Greatest Prison Break. World War I was the first war where aviation played a role. I mean, by this time, planes weren't that old, 10 years maybe. What were militaries doing with planes that they had during the First War?
Yeah, I mean, the planes at this point in time were essentially made up of wood, wire, and some canvas. They were not terribly safe. They were constantly plummeting from the sky. Engines were seizing up. And the generals in charge really didn't think that they would be terribly useful. I mean, they called them one general called it a useless and expensive fad. Another thought that they'd maybe need one or two planes, but that was about it. But they began to find that they were very useful in reconnaissance and artillery observation, not to mention bombing German targets deep behind the lines.
How did they do the bombing? Because I guess they had to develop the technology for, how do you drop a bomb from the air?
Yeah, I mean, originally, again, just to show you how antiquated these were, air-to-air combat was done with rifles initially. Bombs were dropped straight from the cockpit. And it wasn't for a while during the war that they began using, dropping them out of the fuselage. It took a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talk about too, like they'd have grenades and just
exactly throw them over the side of the cockpit. It was rather ridiculous.
And so the British Air Force, I mean, what was the state of the British Air Force at this time compared to the German? Did one have superior air power over the other?
I mean, generally the Royal Flying Corps, the British end of things, and then the German Air Force, they were trading places throughout the course of the war. They were constantly adapting technology. They were building faster planes with more firepower and also training their pilots better. So you find that at the beginning of the war, the Germans were stronger, but as 1950 came along, the British started to sort of gain momentum, and then back again, the Germans sort of taking over things in late 1916, where a lot of these pilots that I feature in the story really come to be captured by the expense of the German flying squadrons that just overwhelm them.
Well, so yeah, as soon as they found out that these airplanes have a role, they had to start ramping up production of the airplanes. But they had to put pilots in there, and there weren't a lot of pilots at the time. So how did they man these airplanes they were building? Did they just kind of like, hey, you want to be a pilot? Here's 2 hours in the air. Okay, you're a pilot. What was that like?
Well, the original pilots of the Royal Air Force were essentially amateurs, people who owned their own planes, who showed up with them and said, I'm willing to fight for my country. But of course, they need more and more pilots as more and more of them are shot down. And so they initially started to recruit them mostly from the sort of Harrow, Eton, Oxford, Cambridge sort of elite people who, as my subtitle says, were daredevils, but people who, rode motorcycles fast. It was rather a ridiculous sort of training recruitment process. They would ask potential pilots who their favorite poet was. Do they like solitude? Was Kipling or Stevenson a better poet? It was.
What was the right answer to that question?
Yes, it was Kipling, actually, and Shelley, just so you know, over Meredith. They liked football players over pianists. Again, it was a rather ridiculous recruitment process, but over time they found who exactly were the best pilots. And their training methods were both extremely dangerous. Half of the pilots were dying over the course of the short training that they received before they were finally sent into mainland Europe to fight.
So yeah, this was a dangerous job. It attracted a certain type of person. And the other issue with these things is that you're behind enemy lines typically because you're doing reconnaissance, you're doing bombing runs. So you're more likely probably to be taken prisoner. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, in 1916, where many of these pilots were captured, the lifespan in the air was 17 minutes long over enemy lines. So you were liable to be shot down in less than a quarter of an hour. And many people died, and many of the pilots were actually captured. And just to give you an idea of sort of how things were at the time, some of the pilots asked for parachutes because that seemed like a good idea. And their bosses in the Air Force said, well, we want you to be able to be motivated to die, to fight to the very last. And so they were not given them.
Yeah. And the other thing they had to do too, you talk about, is they would, as soon as they crash landed, if that's what they could do, they were ordered to destroy the planes as quickly as possible so the Germans couldn't learn about their technology.
Exactly. And so, their initial instinct, of course, was to run for the hills, but they had to destroy these planes. And by the time that happened, they were generally surrounded. And the fact of the matter is that they were given absolutely no training in what to do if they were shot down behind enemy lines, nor were they provisioned in a way that they could escape and evade.
So during World War I, these guys were learning on the fly, and this would later serve soldiers in subsequent wars.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, I mean, this is another interesting concept that a lot of people don't realize is this idea of being a prisoner of war, taking prisoners of war, was a relatively new concept. For most of human history, the rule of the law of war was, if you conquered an army, you either killed them or enslaved them. Now, I think the first time they actually started using prisoners of war on a mass scale was during the Boer War.
Correct.
You saw like Winston Churchill was, we did a podcast with Candace Millard about Winston Churchill's experience as a prisoner of war. But now we see at even more mass scale during World War I. I mean, what caused the nations to decide we're not just gonna kill people when we take them capture. We're not gonna enslave them, but we're gonna put them up in a camp. How did nations agree on that?
Well, it was a long time coming. There was a lot of brutality and a lot of death prior to that. I think probably one of the sort of more grisly stories that you find is this Byzantine emperor who captured about 14,000 prisoners. He had all but 100 of them blinded and he left the last 100 blind and only one eye so they could march back to their hometown. You find that, over the course of time, in the 17th century, some Dutch legal theorists came up with this idea that maybe we should have rules and laws about killing an enemy on the field. And then you find in the Age of Reason that prisoners were considered, okay, these are just men. We don't have the right to take their lives. And so again, over time, Abraham Lincoln codified in the Army Field Manual what to do with prisoners of war. There were the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907 that also tried to, quote unquote, civilize war. And that really led you to World War I, where there were rules in place and obligations for countries to humanely treat the prisoners that they took. But they had no idea what they were going to face in World War I, this industrial warfare where you have millions of soldiers pitted against each other. And so the consequence of that is, of course, you have millions of prisoners. And so you find that Germany and the Allies were overwhelmed with the vast populations of people that they were taking in and having to house and feed and control. And this led to a lot of problems, both in terms of disease, but also in terms of just ill treatment.
Yeah, I mean, what was a typical prisoner of war camp like, let's say in Germany? Because I think when most people think POW, they think, I don't know, I always imagine the Vietnam War, or, John McCain or Stockdale, in solitary confinement in iron shackles. I mean, the way you describe it in the book, it was bad. I'm not going to downplay how it's not great to be a prisoner of war, but it wasn't like the what was that the prisoner of war in Vietnam?
The Hanoi Hilton.
Yeah, Hanoi Hilton, right?
I mean, it's a great question. It was largely a question of who you were more than anything else. If you were an enlisted soldier, you were essentially put into what was a tent city in Germany, where there could be 30,000, 40,000 prisoners held within a certain confinement. And these prisoners were largely used as workers, put in Arbeitskommandos to dig mines, to haul equipment, and do all other kinds of works that the Germans couldn't do themselves because most of their people were up on the front. And then you sort of separate that, of course, from the officers, which was a very different world. In some ways, in many ways, I was surprised at how, quote unquote, cushy life could be for an officer who was imprisoned. I mean, they were put in largely into barracks of former officers of the German army. They were given orderlies to attend to their meals. They were allowed even what was called to walk on parole, which was they could sign a card saying, I vow not to escape, and they could walk outside the prison walls and on their gentlemanly code, not escape. That is not to say, again, that life was cushy, and it largely, again, depended on who the commandant was and what district they were in Germany. Some were in places where they were well treated, and in others, particularly in the case of this story of Holtzman, and they were put in a place and commanded by a man named Karl Niemeyer, who was just an absolute tyrant and made their lives a hell.
Yeah, we'll get to Niemeyer here because he was a character. But this distinction between officers and just regular enlisted soldiers also played a role in who tried to escape from these prisons. What would happen if, say, just a regular enlisted soldier tried to escape from one of these German prisoner camps compared to, say, if an officer escaped?
Well, if an enlisted soldier tried to escape, he was either shot while trying to escape, or he was placed back into an Arbeitskommando that was particularly grueling. So a salt mine or some other sort of heavy labor place where the chances of dying from that were very high. So it was, World War II and the Nazis, they were obviously very brutal to their prisoners, but there was some, predecessor to that in Germany during World War I.
All right, so enlisted soldiers shot or put back in worse conditions if they got recaptured. What would happen if, say, an officer escaped and got recaptured? Was same fate, or was he treated better?
No, very, very different fate. I mean, some of them were, of course, shot while trying to escape, but the large preponderance of them were placed back and often into the same camps that they escaped from, put into isolation. And there were even rules between Germany and Britain about how long you could put these officers into isolation. Was it 2 weeks at a certain point in time? It was a couple months at another point in time. So again, the threat of death was not nearly as high as if you were an enlisted soldier, which of course, if you look at the percentages, many more officers tried to escape than enlisted soldiers.
Right. And a lot of these officers you talk about in the book, they were, I mean, they had made several escape attempts. Remind me this, again, of the Steve McQueen character in The Great Escape. Keeps on trying to escape, gets thrown back into the clinker, gets out, tries to make another escape. I mean, these guys were doing it. So, I mean, why were they? Was it because they wanted their personal freedom, or did they feel like it was their duty as an officer to sort of muck things up for the Germans? So, their escaping contributed to the war effort.
Yeah, I think, you find over the course of reading these letters that these prisoners wrote and their memoirs subsequent to their escape, the motivations were pretty much all over the place. Many of them, of course, just wanted to get back into the fight. They wanted to get back to England or their country and get back into the fray. Others of them considered, okay, they might not be able to escape, but every every expense that the Germans have to expend on keeping prisoners was one less resource that they had to put into the war. And a lot of it was just this sheer sense of shame that they had, which was unwarranted. These prisoners had of being captured. I mean, the ethos at the time is that you shouldn't be captured, and so there was a sense that they had somehow not done the proper thing, and so they wanted to sort of right that wrong by escaping.
Right, that sense of British gentlemanly honor was driving them.
Exactly.
What was the most common? We'll talk about the tunneling. Tunneling was a popular approach, but besides tunneling, what was the most common way to escape from these POW camps during World War I?
Well, they tried everything under the sun. I mean, the level of hijinks that went into some of these escapes is absolutely comic. I mean, some tried to build an airplane at the top of their barracks. Others tried to erect a balloon to carry them over the walls. Many tried to do the sort of standard cutting through the fence or jumping the fences. Others tried to disguise themselves as German officers and just walk right through the front gate. Others tried to hide themselves in the garbage bins that were hauled out beyond the walls. I mean, if it could be thought of, these prisoners thought of it and attempted it. Some buried themselves under the ground with a little reed to breathe in, waiting for the guards to go to sleep, and then trying to escape that way. I mean, it was comic many times, heartbreaking in others.
Yeah, you mentioned a few cases where they got like just within just a few miles of it's Holland, right? Was where they were often trying to go. Few miles, and right there they got captured. And they had to go all the way back, and it was just like, oh man, I can't imagine how that felt.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, the thing was, it was one part to escape the camp, to get beyond the wall. It was quite another. Most of these places were hundreds of miles from the Dutch border where they could find freedom. So not only did they have to escape the prison, but then they had to make their way through enemy occupied territory to reach the border. And again, like you said, I mean, they quite a few of them got within a stone's throw to the border and were nabbed.
Yeah, that's the thing I noticed as I was reading this, that they got really good at escaping. They could get out. They were masters at that, but it was evading was the hardest. And like you said, they received no training on how to evade the enemy behind enemy lines. So they were just making this stuff up as they went.
No, they were. I mean, they had to, make their own compasses. They had no maps about where they needed to go, how to avoid particular military installations. And the fact of the matter was that the Germans employed almost the whole population to be on the lookout for escaped prisoners. So you find that many instances, POWs who had escaped are nabbed or spotted by school children and rounded up.
So there's these officers always trying to escape for different reasons. The really brazen ones and the bold ones and the ones that got really good at it seem to all end up in this one POW camp called Holzminden. Is that how you pronounce it?
Holzminden.
Holzminden. Tell us about this camp and why was it so hard to escape from?
Okay, so you have all these prisoners, right? And the large majority of prisoners, of course, didn't try to escape. You only had this sort of select few who were trying again and again and again to break out. And as you said, many of them were successful and then nabbed at the border. So at a certain point, the Germans decide we need to do something about these escape fiends, as they called them. These people who keep trying and trying and trying. We need to all put them all into one place. We need to make sure that that place is heavily fortified, heavily overseen by security, and make sure that they never escape. And so they come up with this place called Holzminden, which was south of Hanover and was formerly an infantry barracks that they then surrounded by this almost like a Russian nesting doll with a stone wall, and then inside that a high fence, and inside that a no man's land, and inside that another fence. And so it was seemingly, as I call it, a kind of landlocked Alcatraz. And they decided in the fall of 1916 that all these troublemakers should all be placed in this single prison and that they should be overseen by a particularly cruel commandant.
Yeah, so tell us about this guy, because he's interesting. He's German, but he has an American connection.
Yeah, his name is Karl Niemeyer, and I mean he was I guess the best way I describe him, he was a bully of the first order. I mean, he had this terribly rash temper. He was thin-skinned. The prisoners called him everything from a cad to a bloated, pompous, crawling individual to a cheat to the personification of hate. And his background was sort of very foggy. He served in the military, Prussian soldier. He then moved in one story to Milwaukee, served as a bartender. In another story, he lived in New York and made billiard tables. People weren't quite sure what his background was, but he did speak English. He spoke it to a certain extent, although he mauled the language continuously, which was both an object of derision by the prisoners, was also a hilarity. And he found himself in World War I back in Germany, and he, with his twin brother, Heinrich, overseeing camps, prisoner of war camps in Germany.
And how did he treat these guys? I mean, obviously these guys were put in a camp that was very hard to escape from. And what would he do to officers once they got recaptured? Would he do the typical 2 weeks of solitary confinement, or would he punish them even more harsh?
Well, he would harangue them. He would strip them of their clothes. He would put them in isolation. And isolation, by the way, was not something that you necessarily wanted to be placed in. I mean, you could be put in a sort of underground small cell with no exercise, without seeing anybody for weeks and months on end, and go mad. And many of the prisoners went absolutely delirious in isolation. So for the most part, he just abused and put these prisoners in isolation. And on some rare instances, like the man that I called the sort of the British Houdini, who was eventually escaped from 12 camps before he got into the hands of Niemeyer, and it was eventually shot in the back and stabbed by bayonets. So Niemeyer was not against violence by any means.
And he'd often punish the entire camp whenever there was an escape made, preventing them from exercising, stopping mail, things like that.
Locking them in the barracks. And that kind of camp-wide punishment, that wholesale punishment, was against the Hague Conventions that purportedly the Germans subscribed to.
Yeah, and I mean, and these officers, these British officers, they would complain about it, but nothing happened.
Yeah, I mean, letters were snuck out. Prisoners who made it to Holland and back to England and reported about what was happening at Holzminden to the War Office. They knew about it, but there was really nothing they could do. They could do the same to German prisoners, but that really wasn't going to happen.
All right. So what's kind of funny is they put these escape fiends all in the same prison, thinking, this is a really hard prison to escape from. But actually, they kind of backfired on them, because you got all these guys who are really good at escaping together in the same camp, where they could mastermind together. to come up with the ultimate escape. So tell us about some of the men, or these escape artists, as you call them, that got placed in Holzminden.
So you're exactly right. I mean, Holzminden became what I called an escape university. So you have all these prisoners who have escaped in various different ways, who had learned different methods, and you put them all into one place and they just feed off each other and learn from each other. So if you want to know how to make a secret hiding spot, you got someone who's an expert in that. You want to make a makeshift compass, there's someone to do that. If you want to know how to smuggle in supplies or tailor a German uniform or pick a lock or engineer some elaborate construction, there is someone at hand at Holzminden who had done it before, who had been trained in this way. And so you have this just collective of people. Most of them were pilots. They were all officers. One of my favorites was a Canadian lieutenant named William Colquhoun, who was 6 feet 6 inches tall and went by the nickname Shorty, because when he was captured by the Germans, they asked, "Are all you Canadians so tall?" And he said, "Well, they call me Shorty." And this was just the sort of nature of these guys. Another of them was a man named David Gray, who was an army sapper, who was this sort of stiff military guy who didn't like to get his uniform dirty, but became a very good, aggressive pilot, and was one of the sort of leaders of this new plot to escape from Holzminden.
And you also had the guy that I was really intrigued by, Bennett, I think. He was the poet.
Well, you have Harvey, who was a poet and one of the sort of great war poets. And then you also have William Bennett, who was actually a naval observer who was an expert in hiding catches and all the like. So there were just an absolute range of people, officers who like to dress up in drag and escape. You just have the gamut. Well, and you also have the Pink Toes, who were this group of officers who were expert tunnelers, and they were called Pink Toes because their feet were constantly soaked in water, and so they became known as the Pink Toes.
So all these guys get together. They've made different escape attempts while they were there, but then they decided to do this tunnel, which was a long, long tunnel. How did they all get together and agree that this was going to be the thing that would allow them to escape? What was better about this escape plan than the other plans?
So I think, the first reason they needed to, as soon as these guys get into a camp, David Gray or Shorty or Bennett, they survey it. They look around and try to figure out what are the weak spots in the security of this place. And Holzminden, after weeks of such surveillance, they couldn't figure out any way to get out of there. And so the idea of a tunnel, of actually going underneath the ground, seemed like really the only way that they could manage it. The other reason that a tunnel was so attractive was the reason that so many of these men were there is because their typical escape, whether cutting through a fence or going through the front gate in a rush or picking a lock, is the people, the commandant and the officers overseeing them know immediately that they've escaped. And so a manhunt is immediately dispatched, and typically they're rounded up within less than a few hours. But if you build a tunnel and you escape at night, you have a head start, 12 hours, potentially even 6 hours, where you can get away into the countryside and at least have a fighting chance of reaching the border. And so the fact that Holzminden was otherwise impossible to escape from, and B, the fact that a tunnel allowed them to give a head start, was the sort of combining factors that made it so attractive.
And how long of a tunnel do they have to dig?
Well, it seemed like a great idea at the beginning because they thought that it only needed to be 15 yards long. They thought that all they needed to do was go from the basement of one of the barracks underneath the wall, which was quite close, and then up out of the hole, and then off they go. But the problem was, just about the same time they finished that 15 yards, the Commandant Niemeyer put a guard almost on the exact spot that they planned on emerging from. And so it then became a situation where the only way to use that tunnel was to go 150 yards to a field where they could emerge unseen and get away.
All right, so a 165-yard tunnel. basically.
Correct.
That's okay. That's crazy because I played football in high school. 100 yards is really long. I've crawled, on my hands and feet, bear crawled 100 yards, and that was terrible. I can't imagine picking your way. Like, how did they do this without getting detected? Like, how did they not make any noise? What did they use for tools? How did they keep the thing supported? Like, how do they know how to build a tunnel?
I mean, it was absolutely horrifying, the situation that they faced while building this tunnel. And I remember even writing it and thinking to myself, God, I could never have done this. I mean, essentially you have them going into this tunnel, digging through the dirt with spoons, the end of a bed stand. And again, they're not building a tunnel as you probably imagine a tunnel where you can stand up and walk through it, or even crawl on your hands and knees. I mean, it was so small that you could barely lie flat without your back touching the top of the tunnel and your elbows touching the sides. So they were essentially just creating this as small burrow as they could, because the amount of excavations of dirt and stone, they couldn't hide. Plus, it would just take longer. So you have these men. They go in. They're digging away. They haul dirt out with a sack, and they continue onward. And the deeper they get, the staler and the less oxygen the air has. So then they have to create a bellows or feeding air into the system, and it could collapse at any moment. There was dirt constantly falling in your face and down your neck, and at any moment you could basically be interred and killed. And it was particularly for one of the men, Casper Kennard, who was the pilot. He was a claustrophobe. He hated confined spaces, and yet he's down there. He wants to escape so badly. He's down in this dark, dank tunnel, illuminated by a single candle, hacking away at the ground ahead of him.
Yeah, I got claustrophobia just reading it.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
It wouldn't be good. Besides the officers, did other people in the camp know that there was a tunnel? Like, was it an open secret?
It was. I wouldn't call it quite an open secret as much as it was something that, the officers, there was this small cabal of men. So there was this core group of 12 officers, and the head of the tunnel, David Gray, who was called the father of the tunnel, wanted to keep it small. But the fact is they needed some of the orderlies, some of the enlisted men, to help them, not only because they needed supplies, but because the entrance to the tunnel was actually in the orderlies' quarters, underneath their quarters in the basement. So they needed uniforms from them. So a few of them knew. And then as you get further along the story and months pass, more and more people are brought in, because more and more supplies and information and people were needed to be in on the know. So at the end of the day, you had like 50 people who actually knew about the tunnel out of a group of about 600 officers.
Yeah, and even German guards knew about it.
Even some of the German guards were at least knew something was in the works. They had bribed some of the officers, in fact, one, to provide them with acid to melt the iron rod foundation.
So, as we mentioned earlier, escaping was the easy part. What I think was different from previous escape attempts, that these guys really thought hard about evading this time. So what were their plans to evade their captors being recaptured again after they escaped?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what made this the greatest escape of the Great War is not only the sort of cleverness of the tunnel, but the amount of forethought and planning and effort that went into how they're going to make this 150-mile run to the border. One of them planned on dressing up as a businessman and taking a train the whole distance. Others had mapped out a particular route that they could travel by night and hunker down by day. And I think probably my favorite story, and the sort of the heroes of these stories, David Gray and his partners, Cecil Blaine and Casper Kennard, decide the most ingenious plan, which was, every time I think about it, I kind of chuckle at myself. But Gray and Blaine would be disguised as orderlies from an insane asylum, and Kennard would be acting like an escaped lunatic. And if they were stopped by, a local policeman or German officers, Kennard would go into sort of apoplectic fit, and Gray, who spoke German fluently along with 5 other languages, would tell the officers what the deal was, and typically they found that people wanted to usher them out of town as quickly as possible.
Right. I mean, I thought was really fascinating. Not only they had like a workshop and they had like this system for the tunnel, but they created workshops for tailoring clothes, disguising. They had workshops to make forged documents, photos, etc. And they did this again, not knowing exactly what they were doing, and they did this without getting caught.
Yeah, I mean, they had, again, this escape university, so you have experts in all these different fields. And one of the sort of most important ones was a man named Dick Cash, who was this Australian enlisted soldier. He was in his mid 40s. He had all his teeth had been knocked out when he'd been blown sky high on the front. But he was a photographer, and he smuggled in supplies to provide not only photos of the officers for forged documents, but most importantly, duplicates of maps that they needed to make the run to the border. And so all these players were essential. And this couldn't have happened if the Germans hadn't placed all these sort of experts into one place.
Right, like I said, it backfired on them.
It did.
I mean, so how long did the whole plan take from, okay, we're going to dig this tunnel to until they escaped? What was the time frame there?
About 6 months.
6 months. That's a long time.
They thought that's a long time to keep a secret. It's a long time. They thought they'd be out by Christmas. They started in basically, November. They thought they'd be out by Christmas, but the fact was they put the extra guard there, and then they ran into trouble along the way. The tunnel reached a sort of a wall of stones that they couldn't get through for a long time, and then there were times when their entrance that they used to reach the tunnel was shut down. They couldn't use it anymore, so they needed to find another way to actually reach the tunnel that they then needed to dig from. So there was lots of back and forth, lots of near moments where the tunnel was discovered, but they eventually, in July of 1918, made the break.
And how many officers escaped that night?
So you had 29 men actually made it out of the tunnel over that night before it collapsed on some of the officers while they were trying to make their ways through. Those officers were eventually pulled by their heels out of the tunnel, but Niemeyer discovered it that morning. Of the 29, 10 made it to Holland and freedom, and they were paraded as heroes in England. The king visited them, honored them, and their escapades were splashed across the news because it was kind of a triumph against very great odds that played very well in a moment that was very dark in the war.
Yeah, I like one of the guys. He's the one that disguised himself as a businessman and took the trains all the way to Holland. He as soon as he got there, he wrote sent a telegram to Niemeyer. Was like, "Hey, I'm in Holland. If I ever see you, I'm going to break your neck."
Yes, and that was Colonel Rathborn. I mean, he was quite a character, as were many of these people.
Right, and the assailant asylum guys, that ruse worked for them.
That absolutely worked. I mean, they were almost captured in one town, and Kennard went into a fit, and they fed him a fake drug, which was basically aspirin. And he calmed down, and they just wanted to get him out of there as quickly as possible. They barely made it across the border and were shot at as they ran off, but they made it.
Did all these guys go back to the battle after they escaped?
Yes, they were essentially brought back to England and said, take a little time off. And the majority of them went back and rejoined. The majority of them went back and rejoined the RFC or their units, but the war was almost in its last lengths at that point.
Yeah, indeed. Shortly after that, I was talking about like these guys was like they set the example of how to do a POW escape. Like how did the British military, and you can also say, I mean, I imagine the German military learned from this experience, Americans learned from this. How did they codify what these guys did on the fly?
So once these, even during the war, these prisoners would if they escaped, if they were brought back, they wrote testimonies of what life was like, and if they escaped, they wrote testimonies of how they escaped. And many of them wrote sort of memoirs that they never published. And then you find that World War II comes along, and the British start this service called MI9, which I mentioned before, the Escape and Evasion Service. They decide that A lot of people were taken prisoner in World War I. Few of them escaped. What can we do about it? And the officers who were put in charge of starting MI9 said, well, we need to talk to the experts. And the experts were the people from World War I, and many of them were the Holzminden escapees. And so they went to them, and these men, particularly William Bennett, the naval observer, became a professor, a sort of secret professor going from airbase to airbase, giving a slide lecture, teaching pilots and soldiers and naval officers and men what to do if they were found themselves captured. And it ended up helping quite a few of them escape, some famously in The Great Escape and in Colditz, but thousands of others who you've never heard of who got back to their families because of Holtzman and what these men did.
I'm curious, as you were researching and writing about these escape artists, did you take away any life lessons? Like, was there something about these guys that inspired you and you're like, I should try to develop that sort of attribute that these guys manifested with this experience?
Well, I think, my takeaways were first this idea of like, what is freedom? I mean, these officers were in a place where, okay, they were in some ways had it pretty nice. They had people making them tea in the morning and polishing their boots. But the fact that they had no control of their lives, no control of their schedule, what they ate, who they slept, where they slept, sort of caused what Harvey, the poet, said was a kind of moldiness, which was ruining their soul. And this idea of what is freedom, what is essential in humanity, was something that is sort of carried away, particularly Harvey's insights into that. And I think the other one that was key to this story and sort of one that I took away was the idea of camaraderie. David Gray, the father of the tunnel, tried to escape multiple times and essentially given up until he found himself at Holzminden and decided that he needed to depend on other people. He needed to depend on his friends to make it out and to make it through. And those are the ones that got him through the darkest hours. And he never would have escaped, nor would the others if they hadn't done it together.
I love that. Well, Neal, is there some place people can go to learn more about the book?
I think there is. They could go to the Amazon, their local bookstore. They could go to my website, Neal Bascomb, NealBascomb.com.
Well, Neal Bascomb, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Great to be back.
My guest today was Neal Bascomb. He's the author of the book, The Escape Artist. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find out more information about Neal's work at nealbascomb.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/escapeartist, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.